morning. Call the regular board meeting to order. We have already done the pledge for the public hearing, so we'll move into roll call.
Mr. Morrow?
Here.
Mr. Harrington?
Here.
Mr. Maryhill?
Here.
Mr. Gardner?
Here.
Mr. Depot?
Here.
Mr. Fairby?
Here.
Mr. Blades?
Here.
Mr. McNally?
Here.
Mr. Skosvala?
Here.
Mr. Cannon?
Here.
Mr. Pleedy?
Here.
Mr. Moore? He's here. Mr. Murnell?
Here.
Mr. Whitson?
Here.
Mr. Grinnell?
Here.
Mr. Connell?
Here.
Mr. Gilliland?
Here.
And Mr. Preston?
Here.
Thank you.
We have no guests. But before we move into resolutions, I do want to make mention that we do have a birthday boy in the house. Mr. Gilliland, I believe today is your birthday. Yes. Sorry that we don't have a cake, but fire code doesn't allow us to put that many candles in one building, so congratulations on making it another year. Thank you. You're welcome. With that, we'll move into resolutions.
Resolution number 179, authorizing budget amendments for various departments.
Moved by Mr. Maryhill, second. Mr. Morrow. Comments or questions? Not roll call.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Fairby?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skosvala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleedy?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Murnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 180, authorizing the purchasing agent to go out to bid and award for a UPS security system in the Sheriff's Department, with funds to be transferred from the contingency account in the amount up to $14,303.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? Hearing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Fairby?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skosvala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleedy?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Murnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries.
Mr. Skosvala?
Yes, I don't have any resolutions.
I said they're on their way.
Oh, they're on their way.
They're coming, and she's copying more. They were all mailed out, so.
Did you not receive them in the mail, Mr. Skosvala, or by email?
But she's bringing them in, Tom.
Well, just so it's not me, Mr. Grinnell doesn't have any either.
Okay.
You don't normally pay attention to giving something away.
They were mailed on Wednesday, but
It was a rough weekend.
they should be on their way. She's bringing them in for me. Resolution 181, authorizing the renaming of County Route 29 in the town of Minerva to the Warren County line, Route 28N, the Eric LaSalle Memorial Highway.
Moved by Mr. McNally. Second. Thank you.
Do you want me to wait? Resolution 182 of condolence to the family of Calvin W. Cross, Jr.
Moved by Mr. Gilliland. Or Grinnell. Second. Thank you.
Resolution 183 of condolence to the family of Daniel A. Prey.
Moved by Mr. Morrow.
Resolution 184, authorizing to apply for and accept a state assistance grant for a municipal waste reduction and a recycling project, and authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute the master grant contract under the appropriate laws of New York State.
Moved by Mr. Gardner. Second. Mr. Marnell. Comments or questions? None. Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Fairby?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skosvala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleedy?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Murnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland? Sorry. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 185, authorizing the conveyance of property designated as parcel number 209 on the list of delinquent taxes for the year 2009, previously owned by Tina Crowningshield in the town of Lewis, bearing tax map number 38.3-1-36.300 to the Vanderbilt Mortgage and Finance Incorporated for the amount of $12,598.05.
Moved by Mr. Blades. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Cannon. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 186, authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute an agreement with VNA Home Care Options, LLC, and Public Health Certified Home Health Aid Services to provide health and long-term care services to eligible enrollees.
Moved by Mr. Connell, second. Mr. Blades. Comments or questions? Being none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 187, authorizing a payment for mileage reimbursement to David Wainwright, Real Property Tax Office from January 26, 2015 through March 27, 2015, in the amount of $232.88, and to Don Sears, Real Property Tax Office from February 13, 2015 through February 27, 2015, in the amount of $33.35.
Moved by Mr. Cannon, second by Mr. Marnell. Comments or questions? Being none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 188, authorizing the Essex County Chairman or County Manager to execute the New York State CDBG Project Grant Program, bearing contract number 382CRF-ME801-14 for the Microenterprise Grant Program between Essex County and Essex County IDA in the total amount of $154,477 as recommended by the Southern Essex County Lake Champlain Grant Review Committee, and to execute any and all associated subrecipient agreements.
Moved by Mr. Grinnell, second by Mr. Harrington. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 189, authorizing a payment to the Hartford Insurance Company in the amount of $5,195 for increased coverage of communications equipment for the Essex County Radio Project.
Moved by Mr. Whitson. Second. Mr. Kyle and Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 190 of appreciation to all New York State, federal, and local law enforcement agencies and authorities involved in the capture of escaped convicts Richard Knott and David Swapp.
Moved by Mr. Blades.
Second.
Thank you.
Resolution 191, authorizing the county attorney to prepare the necessary documentation to establish a reserve account for the demolition and removal of unsafe buildings situate on property owned by the Essex County acquired through tax sale or otherwise to be funded from monies received from Essex County in REM tax foreclosure tax proceedings.
Moved by Mr. Scottafatto. Do I have a second? Mr. Harrington, Mr. Brunel, Mr. Flea.
Dan, with regard to the establishment of the reserve, should we establish some type of a percentage of funds, like 5% of the take or whatever, or whatever?
You don't, well,
Go ahead. No,
you don't need to establish an amount.
Okay.
So what we'll do is establish the fund, and then whatever you determine after each tax sale that you want to
Okay.
put in there, you'll be able to put in there. That way you won't limit yourself.
thank you.
So your intent then is to change this yearly, depending on the revenue that's collected?
Depending on the amount of money in the reserve fund, that was the point. Thank you.
The question Dan and I talked about a little bit is how we're going to set priorities. I mean, how are you going to set what town we go to first, second? Any comment on that?
Well, my understanding was that Chris Garrell was going to go around, visit each one of these properties. We had talked about this in the past. I would think he'd be able to prioritize the condition of each one of these buildings. Didn't we talk about that, Dan?
Well, we did talk about it, but in thinking about it, and I had discussion with Randy and Bill, I think it's a lot to put on department head for him to choose which building is going to get selected. I almost think there should be some input from the board as to, he could come back to the board and say, okay, this one's in this shape, and this one's in this shape, and this one's in this shape. Which ones do you want me to
Don't put
fix?
Scottafatto on this committee, or they'll be in Mariah
I know.
5 years. But he doesn't know who owns them.
Under the terms of the capital reserve, when I set this up, you're going to need a board resolution to expend money from it anyway. So,
I'd like to address that.
I do apologize.
This is why we didn't give you the...
Well, let me explain. I had calls from the mayor. I saw Mike Diskin at the 4th of July parade. That property was not sold in the first tax sale. It was pulled, or whoever bought it reneged on it, and then I didn't realize that it had been sold in the prior sale. We've had discussions on that property before. I was contacted by the mayor of the village of Port Henry to do something with the property. In fact, Dan received a letter not so long ago where the village was going to go in there and take the property down. So obviously, I'm not the only one that didn't realize that that property had not been sold. You recall that letter, Dan? When they,
yeah, that's what I responded to.
No, this was another letter that came a few months ago when they were in there doing construction.
June 19th was the date of the letter.
Not this letter. There was another letter, Dan, you remember, prior to
I don't
this.
think it was a letter, I think it was actually an email.
They were going to go in the company and take the bill. But anyway, there was a lot of confusion on this piece of property.
Tom, the confusion probably lays with this is, when Essex County owned it, if you looked up the tax rolls,
Right.
if you looked up the tax rolls anytime before March, taxable status date of this year, it's going to say Essex County.
Essex County,
If you look at
correct.
the tax rolls, after March 1st of this year, 2015 taxable status date, it goes into the name of the guy that bought it. So that may be where the village of Port Henry didn't pursue it, and that's how you probably got your bad information.
But anyway, back to we just received a letter here from Dan Manning in regards to any properties that are going into the next tax sale to go out, list them, and make sure that you're aware of any issues.
That letter was sent out also at the beginning of the year, but I sent it out again.
And I actually think that should be the town's responsibility. We all have code enforcement officers. We all are aware of these properties. I mean, I see two on here already that are open mine shafts that belong to persons and persons. Now, obviously, we don't want the liability associated with those properties, and that's what they're trying to do, is get away from that liability. So, I will certainly work on a list, and I'll work with the village also to...
Yeah, and if I could get that sooner rather than later, because last week, the end of the week, we were given by IT the final list, which is what I sent out, and I drafted the order, the decision, the motion, and all the paperwork that's required to get the judge to sign and get a deed to these properties in our name, which will then be sold at auction. And speaking with Mike Diskin too, the auction will probably be sometime in September, only because Haroff is booked up with all these other counties, so.
What's going to be difficult for a town to do an assessment on is obviously if there's asbestos in a house. Now, most of these houses are older homes that have dilapidated, and there's going to be asbestos in them. There's no question about it. I don't think that's a reason why you should pull it from a tax sale.
Probably won't if it has asbestos. It's just not been tampered with, and
I think what we're looking for, correct me if I'm wrong, are hazardous waste sites, open mine shafts, things along those areas. Not so much the condition of a building that sits on a property.
No, I'm more concerned with, gasoline and oil spills, old battery dumps, open mine shafts, sinkholes, I don't know, anything that really stands out.
Yeah, I guess the way I see this working is that once the auction was completed, when we come back to the board for approval of the auction, a resolution would be determined at that time how much you're going to put into the reserve fund.
Right, and then if you want to expend money from that reserve fund, you need a board resolution. That's how reserve funds work.
Can I ask one more question? So on the properties that such as the open mine shaft, that we do not foreclose on, what happens to that property? They continue in ownership, don't pay any taxes, but they just continue to own that. So in other words, that liability, I assume what we're looking for is relief from liability on us, is that they are still responsible for the property as long as we don't foreclose.
Right, if we don't take it by deed, it's still in the property owner's name. So if something happens on that property, it's that property owner's problem. There are mechanisms, brownfields, grants, and things of that nature. If you had a huge dump that was a public health hazard, but we didn't want to take it through tax sale because of liability, and we could get brownfields monies, towns and villages and counties can get those monies to clean them up. Then you would take it after that, after it's all cleaned up. So it's still the property owner's responsibility, but it does stay off the tax rolls.
Any further questions? Being none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Fairby?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. We have one from the floor, supporting the 2015 consolidated funding application for the 5-town hub grant between the towns of Indian Lake, Long Lake, Minerva, North Hudson, and Newcomb.
Good. We've got Mr. Cannon.
Permission to put that on for...
12 allowed on floor.
Yes, we do.
Second. Mr. Moore. Unanimous second, or? Unanimous second. Yeah, thank you. Any other resolutions to come from the floor? Nothing else? Mr. President.
I'd like to move a motion of appreciation to Joe Martens, the DEC Commissioner, that's stepping down. I think anyone in this room that's had any contact with Joe was great to work with. He did an outstanding job, and he truly was good for Essex County and the Adirondacks, and thoroughly understood all the Adirondack issues, and those will be a tough pair of shoes to fill.
12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Unanimous second. Thank you. Anything else? Mr. Preston.
Just informational purposes, the Adirondack Challenge is July 19th, and you have until Friday to sign up for the various events. We're trying to put together a rafting group, so if anyone's interested, Fairby's, you're going to be on your motorcycle still, I
believe there's 2 openings on the raft. I believe, Mr. Preston, you're going to do one, so there's 2 remaining openings. You're going to do a Clinton County and Essex County raft this year, so basically 3.
But you have till Friday to sign up for
So if
the
you
events.
let me know if you're interested. Thank you. Tom, we're gonna do the motorcycle thing, if you're gonna do that this year, just let us know. Mr. Grinnell?
Just two comments. One, Ticonderoga has been suffering with inadequate radio reception and communication capabilities, and I want to thank Mr. Palmer publicly for bringing that to a very satisfactory resolution. And the other item is that I'd like to thank Mr. Scazafano, if you believe that. He did honor his debt last fall, his gambling debt. He has a problem that way. And he appeared in the 4th of July parade in Ticonderoga, dressed very nattily in a Sentinel purple and white jersey, and I can tell you, he took a shellacking going through Ticonderoga. It was more fun than barrel home.
Good. We'll be on the picture.
Thanks, Tom.
I'm used to taking a shellac.
Anything else? Come before the committee? Now,